Everyone, welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament, looking at the New Testament church. And today we're going to still be in Colossians 3:18 through 4:1, and this is instructions for Christian households. And so I think we'll learn a lot. I hope we will learn a lot from this one. And I'm going to try to dive into this one and hopefully look at this maybe from a different aspect or different view than maybe it's been taught before. At least I hope so. But I hope we learn from it as we go through it. So Colossians 3:18 verses 4 through 1 it says, "Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting for those who belong to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and never treat them harshly. Children, always obey your parents, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not aggravate your children, or they will become discouraged. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything you do. Try to please them all the time, not just when they are watching you. Serve them sincerely because of your reverent fear of the Lord. Work willingly at whatever you do as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people. Remember that the Lord will give you an inheritance as your reward, and that the master you are serving is Christ. But if you do what is wrong, you will be paid back for the wrong you have done, for God has no favorites. Masters, be just and fair to your slaves. Remember that you also have a master in heaven." And so we're going to hit all these. I know this is shorter, but I think we're maybe spend a little bit of time on these. Um, this series here is of exhortations by Paul. Is basically, it's called a household code, um, and this was common in Roman times. So Paul gives instructions to the wives, to the husbands, to the children, to the fathers, and to the slaves and to the masters. So he gives basically a short description of how each one of them should behave. Such code actually appears in Greco-Roman writers and elsewhere in the New Testament. So this was not unusual to see something like this. He starts off by telling the wives to submit to your husbands, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper in this as we go into some more of Paul's writings, because this is kind of a shorter version of some stuff that we'll look at. But he doesn't tell his wives to obey, which was typical in Roman household. Paul appeals to them to submit, and there's a difference here, and it's based on his conviction that men were given a given leadership role in the family. And I think anyone can agree with that. If you look at the way that everything was um, laid out, from creation to a lot of things, the men are to be the leaders, like, of the household. Now, again, this isn't a dictator or anything like that. It's someone who loves and cares for his wife and will do whatever and lead in such a way that will take care of her. And so the idea is that wives should, the idea is that wives should just submit to this person, right? And not in oh, I bow down to you, but it's, I submit to your leadership because I know you want what's best for me. And so you're going to do what's best for me. And so that's kind of the idea here. The term suggests an ordering of society in which wives should align themselves with and respect the leadership of their husbands. And so it's not a bowing down. It's okay, I'm respecting your role, and I'm going to submit to your role as the leader, especially the spiritual leader of the household. And we're going to do that. And so, um, Paul here he's not telling the wives to follow the prevailing cultural patterns of the day, but to live as what's fitting for the Lord. And so what we're going to see in all these instructions that Paul gives, 7 times in these 9 verses, Paul roots his instructions in the Lord. We see the Lord mentioned 7 times, or some equivalent term. And so this is stressing the importance of evaluating everything in the light of Christ and his teaching. And so this is the thing, is like, you know, wives, submit to your husbands, right, as is fitting in the Lord, right? Men, are to lead as is fitting as a Christian should, as someone who's in the Lord should, and stuff like that. And so he goes on to say, hey, don't be harsh. He's like, husbands, don't be harsh with them, right? There was a tendency in the Roman world for men to rage bitterly against their wives and mistreat them. And so he's saying, do not mistreat your wives. And he's going to expand on this a little bit more later on. And so we'll dive even deeper into that. But the idea here is this submitting to one another and stuff like that Paul later on tells them to do. This is out of love and out of respect and out of kindness and the type of Christ that love had, or the type of love Christ had. And that's the idea here. I know that this has been twisted by some people in the church to mean things that it doesn't. Um, but this is to look Christ-like, and so that's what. So he's saying, don't be harsh with them. Don't be harsh with your wives. Because men are like what? Men have greater strength. They have louder voices. Men in their sinful natures were prone to use harsh words, threat, unkindness, and even physical violence to intimidate their wives. And so that was not uncommon in Roman, in the that culture and older cultures. It's not uncommon today. We see it in households and things like that today. And so Paul's saying you're not to act like that. You're to love your wives. You're to treat them the way that Christ would want you to treat them. And we'll look at that more. And so whenever sometimes people see these verses, even in the Christian faith, they'll try to say, oh, well, a woman has to do what I say. You have to submit to me. That's not what this is talking about. Right. One, if the submission that he's talking about, the type of person is someone who wouldn't say that. So if you're going to be like Christ, then you would never even say something like that. And so we need to make sure that we have a true understanding of what this type of submission and respect and stuff inside of Christ looks like inside of a Christian home. And it's not a dictatorship. It's a mutual respect for one another. It's someone who it's the type of situation where the wife would say, hey, I know this person loves and cares for me and is leading for me so much that I would want to submit to them. And that's the idea. And so that's what we need to make sure that we see there. And so he then goes on to tell slaves to obey in everything that those who are in everything those who are your earthly masters. And so this relationship, the relationship between husbands and wives, and parents and children are ordained by God from creation. Slavery is not. And so we need to look at this. Paul's instructions on marriage represent the perfect will of God. Slavery, on the other hand, is something that was created by human beings and does not represent God's will for creation. This is not what God wanted. And so the scriptures regulate the institution without commending it. And we see this in 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, 1 Timothy. We're gonna see it some too. Um, and it calls it out as for the evil of trafficking, like even trafficking human is condemned. We see that in 1 Timothy. We also are going to see that in Revelations. And so here's what we have to understand. Just because the Bible talks to something doesn't mean that it condones it, right? And so it speaks to slavery. It speaks to the issue of slavery. And the simple fact is the realization is that slavery existed in this time. And Christ did not come. He did come to free us. He came to free us all. But the main purpose of Christianity wasn't to free slaves. Now, the result of Christianity, I believe, is people who are free today. I truly believe if it wasn't for Christianity, and those who believe that slavery and stuff would still be extremely widespread. Not to say that we don't still see it today. We know that it's in different forms. But the core of Christianity is against this, and we'll see this. So, like I said, but in any other city, like in any city in this time, or any village in the Roman world, there would have been many slaves at Colossus. And so Paul treats them with dignity and appeals to them directly to honor Christ in their hearts with their work and their behavior. And so his goal, he's there to spread the message of Christ. Paul's not there to free slaves. Now, he does work towards that. We just read the book of Philemon, where that was the whole purpose of writing that book was to have someone who was a slave free. And so we understand that we don't agree with it and doesn't support slavery. We would like to see it ended, or he would have liked to see it ended, but that's not his main mission. That's not his mission. Now, I believe he understood, and I think we need to understand this sometimes, is sometimes we'll attack the issues head on, when if we would just do what we're called to do, the issues would work themselves out in the long run. And I think that's where we sometimes we'll get so caught up in politics or in certain issues and stuff like that. And some of the issues, like abortion, right? Things like abortion, as Christians, we're against that and some of that. But sometimes instead of focusing just on the abortion issue, if we were to focus on converting people, well, then the abortion issue would take care of itself. If you converted everyone to Christianity, well, then people would stop getting abortions or they're going to try to attempt to live their life. And so attempt to live the life that we're called to live. And so that's where I think sometimes we miss it. Like we miss the target. We because we're trying to go straight to to the end result versus if we just did what we were called to do, then a lot of these issues or most of these issues would take care of themselves. Not to say that things wouldn't still happen. We live in an imperfect world. But I think that's what Paul's doing here. Instead of attacking the issue head on, he's saying, "Hey, I know this stuff exists. So if since it does exist, those who are slaves, right, work as if you're working for the Lord, right? I can't free you, so you act and behave in such a way that your master's gonna be like, man, what is up with this guy, right? And so the other thing side of this is that this slave master relationship talks about. I think it applies directly to our work lives today as well, right? Work manager boss type relationships, right? If you work for someone, sometimes maybe sometimes it seems like you're a slave, and maybe I shouldn't do that because I think it say that because I think maybe it it's a little insensitive to the, but in the back of your mind sometimes I know you're like, man, my boss can be a slave driver, and so but it's saying work for the Lord, like whatever you do, right? Whether you're a slave, whether you're free, whatever you're doing, work as if you're working for the Lord. And then Paul addresses the masters or the people who are in charge in this thing, and he says, treat your slaves justly and fairly. Right, because it was not uncommon in that day to treat them people, treat the slaves horrible. Now, again, we have to understand, and I tried to emphasize this every time we talk about this subject. Slavery back then was different than everyone, especially in America, in the American context, thinks to the type of slavery we saw in the early part of the American history, and that's not what it wasn't. This I own you, I can do whatever I want with you type of relationship. Slavery in that day a lot of times was typically what you would call indentured servitude or something like that. It's basically I owe a debt, or I owe, not that that person owns me. It's I owe them, and so I'm going to work this off. And so I'm that person's slave, that person's servant, until I can work earn my freedom and stuff like that. And so whereas in the American history, basically the person bought the slave, the master bought that person. It was for them to do whatever they wanted to with. And so there was, horrible abuses, horrible things like that we saw. And so, not to say that they didn't happen back in this day, but it was different. It was different. And so, we need to understand that. But the idea was still, you treat them fairly, you treat them justly, you treat them fairly. So he's not condoning the system of slavery, but instead he provides instructions to believing masters and slaves regarding their relationship to each other in Christ. And so it clearly shows, these type of instructions clearly show the seeds for the eventual dismantling of the unjust structure and that we saw. And so I truly believe that Christianity helped lead to the dismantling of a lot of the Christian or the slavery type situations that we see, or the slavery we saw across the world, and even in the United States. And so while again Christ didn't come to abolish slavery, I do believe the end result of people converting to Christianity was that we saw less and less and less of it. And so again, I think we can use history to flesh that out and look at that. And so I wanted to speak to that. But anyways, looking at this, right? These are the instructions for how we are to behave in our household, our work relationships, our if you're a boss, how you're supposed to treat your people. If you work for someone, how you're to work, even if that person doesn't treat you fairly. How husbands are supposed to treat their wives, how wives. And then I didn't go into the notes of children, right? But the children are to obey, and the parents shouldn't do things to aggravate their children, right? You should do something to encourage them and lift them up, and those type of things. So I hope you learned from this. I hope maybe it was addressed from a different approach. I don't know. I try to sometimes grab these things from a different angle to maybe get a different viewpoint from them, especially different than I know what's been taught, especially when it comes to husband-wife relationships in the church sometimes. And so again, I hope y'all have learned from it. As always, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't done so. That way, you can follow along with us if you would like to. But as always, more than anything, I appreciate those who take the time to watch, and I hope y'all have a wonderful day.